The salt stung my eyes as the wind whipped off the English Channel. I, Will of York, a simple footman in the army of King Edward Roman III, squinted at the shores of Normandy rising before us. It was July 1346, and the 100 Years' War, a conflict I barely understood, had dragged me from my family's modest farm and thrust me into the heart of a foreign land. I gripped my spear tightly, its worn shaft familiar in my calloused hands. It was a far cry from the pitchfork I used to wield, but it had become my only solace in this chaotic world of marching, mud, and the ever-present threat of violence. Beside me, my fellow footmen muttered prayers and curses in equal measure. A few, like me, were green boys barely out of their teens. Others were hardened veterans with faces etched by countless campaigns. We were a motley crew, united only by our common birthright and our unwavering loyalty to our king. "Steady, lads," barked Sir Henry Percy, our lord and commander. He sat astride his destrier, a towering figure clad in gleaming plate armor. His voice, though gruff, was laced with a confidence that steadied my nerves. "Today, we make history. Today, we show those French dogs the might of England." A ragged cheer rose from our ranks, a mix of fear and bravado. I joined in, my voice a mere croak amidst the din. As our longboats grated against the pebbled beach, I took a deep breath of the salty air, steeling myself for what lay ahead. The invasion of Normandy had begun. The first few days of the invasion were a blur of marching and foraging. We swept through the Norman countryside like a plague of locusts, seizing grain, livestock, and anything else of value. Though I'd been raised to respect the land and its bounty, the harsh realities of war had quickly taught me that survival trumped all else. The French peasants, terrified by our advance, fled their homes and hid in the woods. Some, braver than the rest, tried to resist, but their pitchforks and rusty swords were no match for our disciplined ranks. I witnessed a few skirmishes, brief and brutal affairs that left me shaken but strangely unscathed. The first real test of our mettle came at Caen, a walled city that dared to defy our king's authority. As we approached its imposing ramparts, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The air thrummed with tension, and the veterans amongst us exchanged grim glances. Sir Henry gathered us in a field outside the city, his voice booming across the ranks. "Caen is a viper's nest, teeming with French vermin. But fear not, for we hold the advantage. Our longbowmen, the finest in the world, will rain death upon the defenders. Then we shall storm the walls and teach those arrogant Frenchmen a lesson they won't soon forget." His words stirred a fire in my belly, a mix of fear and anticipation. I glanced at my comrades, their faces hardened with resolve. We were ready to fight, to prove our worth on the battlefield. The siege began with a deafening barrage of arrows. Our longbowmen, perched atop a nearby hill, unleashed a storm of feathered shafts that darkened the sky. The French, caught off guard, scrambled for cover, their cries of pain and terror echoing across the fields. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and violet, our siege engines rumbled into position. I watched in awe as massive trebuchets hurled boulders at the city walls, sending showers of stone and mortar raining down upon the defenders. Under cover of darkness, we footmen crept towards the city walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I clutched my shield, a crudely painted wooden thing emblazoned with the Percy lion. The veterans had warned me about the horrors that awaited us: the boiling oil, the sharpened stakes, the desperate defenders fighting for their homes. A ladder was thrust into my hands, and I scrambled up the rough wood, my legs trembling with adrenaline. As I reached the top, a French soldier lunged at me, his face contorted with rage. I parried his blow with my shield and thrust my spear into his chest. He crumpled at my feet, his lifeblood staining the cobblestones. The battle for Caen was a nightmare of blood and steel. I fought with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed, driven by fear, anger, and the desperate need to survive. I saw friends fall, their bodies pierced by arrows or hacked apart by swords. I felt the sting of blows against my shield and armor, the heat of burning timbers as fires raged through the streets. Yet, somehow, I endured. I fought alongside my fellow footmen, a band of brothers forged in the crucible of war. We pushed the French back, inch by bloody inch, until the city was ours. The aftermath was a scene of utter devastation. The streets were littered with corpses, both French and English. Buildings smouldered, their roofs collapsed, their walls scarred by battle. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the cost of victory. I wandered through the ruins, my senses numbed by the carnage. I saw French civilians huddled in corners, their faces pale with terror. Some glared at me with hatred, others begged for mercy. I didn't know how to respond, my mind reeling from the horrors I'd witnessed. As night fell, I found a deserted alleyway and collapsed against a wall. Exhaustion washed over me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by the ghosts of the fallen. The Caen sack lasted 5 days. It was a time of lawlessness and brutality, a stark contrast to the disciplined advance that had brought us here. I witnessed things that I'd rather forget, acts of cruelty committed by both English and French alike. I saw men driven mad by greed and bloodlust, their humanity stripped away by the horrors of war. Yet, amidst the chaos, I also glimpsed moments of kindness and compassion. I saw our medics tending to wounded prisoners, offering them water and bandages. I heard stories of English soldiers sharing their rations with starving civilians, risking punishment for their disobedience. These small acts of decency gave me hope, reminding me that even in the darkest of times, there was still good in the world. After Caen, our army resumed its relentless march across Normandy. We followed the Seine River, our destination the French capital of Paris. It was a grueling journey, marked by scorching heat, torrential rain, and constant skirmishes with French forces. One day, as we rested by the riverbank, I struck up a conversation with a young squire named William. He was a few years older than me, with a mop of curly brown hair and a mischievous grin. We shared stories of our homes and families, our dreams and fears. For a brief moment, I forgot about the war and the horrors we'd endured. William told me about his aspirations to become a knight, to fight for glory and honor. I listened with a mix of envy and admiration. I'd never considered such a lofty goal for myself. My only ambition was to survive this war and return home to my family. As we talked, I realized that William and I came from very different worlds. He was the son of a nobleman, raised in a castle and trained from a young age in the arts of warfare. I was a peasant, a simple farmer's son who'd been thrust into a conflict I didn't understand. Yet, despite our differences, we found common ground in our shared experiences. We'd both witnessed the brutality of war, the loss of life, the senseless destruction. We'd both been forced to grow up too fast, to confront the harsh realities of a world in turmoil. Our conversation was interrupted by the blare of a trumpet. It was time to move on, to continue our march towards Paris. I said goodbye to William, promising to find him again if we survived the war. As we neared Paris, the mood in the army shifted. The initial euphoria of our victories had given way to grim resolve. We knew that the French would not let us take their capital without a fight. Scouts returned with reports of a massive French army gathering to block our path. King Philip Roman VI himself was said to be leading the host, eager to avenge the humiliation we had inflicted upon his kingdom. Our own forces were stretched thin, our supplies dwindling. Many of us were tired of constant marching and fighting. Yet, King Edward remained undeterred. He was a master strategist, a cunning fox who always seemed to be one step ahead of his enemies. One evening, as we camped on the outskirts of a small village, a hushed rumor spread through the ranks. King Edward had chosen a battlefield, a place where he believed we could defeat the French despite their superior numbers. The place's name was Crécy. I'd heard of Crécy before, a small town nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. It seemed like an unlikely place for a decisive battle, but I trusted King Edward's judgment. He had led us this far, and I believed he would lead us to victory once more. The night before the battle, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay awake, staring up at the starry sky, my mind racing with thoughts of what the morrow might bring. I thought of my family back in York, of my mother's warm smile and my father's calloused hands. I wondered if I would ever see them again. As dawn approached, I rose and joined my fellow footmen. We ate a meagre breakfast of bread and cheese, washed down with stale ale. Then we formed ranks and marched towards Crécy, our hearts heavy with anticipation. The sight that greeted us was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The French army stretched across the valley like a vast, undulating sea of banners and steel. Their numbers were overwhelming, their cavalry a glittering mass of armoured knights. Yet our own lines held firm, our longbowmen taking up positions on the flanks. Sir Henry rode along our ranks, his voice ringing with encouragement. "Remember Caen, lads, remember the glory we won there. Today, we shall add another chapter to the annals of English valour." His words stirred a flicker of hope in my heart. Perhaps, against all odds, we could achieve the impossible. Perhaps we could defeat the French and make history. The air thrummed with an eerie tension as the two armies locked eyes across the battlefield. The French, resplendent in their polished armour, seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sun. Their banners fluttered proudly, bearing the fleur-de-lis and the heraldic symbols of their noble houses. It was a sight to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. King Edward, atop a hill overlooking the battlefield, surveyed the scene with a calm demeanour. He had chosen this ground carefully, utilising the natural terrain to our advantage. The valley was flanked by two wooded areas, perfect for concealing our longbowmen. A gentle slope rose towards the French position, giving us a clear line of fire. The battle began not with a clash of steel, but with a torrential downpour. The rain lashed down, turning the battlefield into a quagmire. The French, confident in their superior numbers and the prowess of their cavalry, charged forward, their horses slipping and sliding in the mud. Their advance was met by a storm of arrows. Our longbowmen, sheltered by the woods, unleashed volley after volley, their deadly shafts whistling through the air. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries in the French army, were no match for our archers. Their crossbows, cumbersome and slow to reload, were rendered useless in the rain. I watched in horror as the Genoese fell, their bodies riddled with arrows. Their cries of pain and terror mingled with the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel. The French knights, undeterred, pressed on, their charge faltering as they struggled to maintain formation in the treacherous conditions. Sir Henry, sensing an opportunity, bellowed the order to advance. We footmen surged forward, our shields raised, our spears levelled. The clash was brutal, a maelstrom of steel and flesh. I thrust and parried, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw men fall all around me, their lives extinguished in an instant. The French knights, hampered by the mud and the relentless rain of arrows, struggled to break through our lines. Their horses reared and bucked, their riders losing their balance and falling into the mire. It was a chaotic scene, a vision of hell on earth. As the sun began to set, the tide of battle turned. The French, exhausted and demoralized, began to retreat. Their once proud banners now lay trampled in the mud, their armor dented and stained with blood. We had won. Against all odds, we had defeated a far larger and better equipped army. The victory at Crécy would go down in history as one of England's greatest triumphs, a testament to the skill of our archers and the courage of our footmen. The aftermath of Crécy was a chilling tableau of carnage and triumph. The field, once green and vibrant, was now a mire of mud and blood, strewn with the broken bodies of men and horses. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the terrible price of victory. I wandered amongst the fallen, my stomach churning at the sight of so much suffering. The faces of the dead, contorted in their final agonies, haunted me. I saw young boys, barely older than myself, their eyes wide with terror, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I saw seasoned warriors, their armor rent asunder, their faces frozen in expressions of rage and despair. Amidst the carnage, I found William. He lay on his back, his eyes closed, his chest still rising and falling with shallow breaths. He had a nasty gash on his forehead and several arrows protruding from his shield and armor, but he was alive. I knelt beside him, my heart filled with relief. I tore a strip of cloth from my tunic and used it to stanch the bleeding from his head wound. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Will?" he whispered, his voice weak. "I'm here," I said, gripping his hand. "You're going to be all right." He managed a faint smile. "Crécy," he murmured. "We won." "Yes, we won," I said. helping him sit up, but at a terrible cost. He nodded, his gaze drifting across the battlefield. "So many dead," he said softly. "So much wasted life." I couldn't disagree. The victory at Crecy had come at a heavy price. Thousands of men lay dead or dying, their dreams and aspirations extinguished in the mud and blood. As we waited for the medics to arrive, William and I talked. We shared our experiences of battle, fear, adrenaline, moments of heroism and despair. We talked about our hopes for the future, our dreams of returning home. When the medics finally arrived, they took William to a makeshift field hospital. I never saw him again, but I often thought of him in the years that followed. He reminded me that even in the midst of war, there could be camaraderie and compassion. In the wake of our stunning victory at Crecy, a wave of jubilation swept through the English camp. Songs were sung, ale flowed freely, and tales of individual heroics were recounted around crackling fires. Yet, beneath the veneer of celebration, I felt a profound sense of unease. The cost of victory had been too high, the battle scars too deep. We remained at Crecy for several days, burying the dead and tending to the wounded. The sheer number of casualties was staggering. The French had lost thousands of men, including many of their noblest knights. Our own losses, though less severe, were still significant. King Edward, ever the pragmatist, wasted no time in capitalizing on our victory. He ordered us to march north towards Calais, a strategic port city that would give us a foothold on the continent. The siege of Calais was a long and arduous affair, lasting nearly a year. It was a test of endurance, a battle of attrition that pushed us to the limits of our physical and mental strength. We lived in squalid conditions, our clothes ragged, our food scarce. Disease ran rampant through the camp, claiming more lives than the French defenders. Yet we persevered, driven by the knowledge that Calais was the key to victory in this long and bloody war. During the siege, I witnessed acts of both bravery and desperation. I saw our engineers construct ingenious siege weapons, capable of hurling massive stones and flaming projectiles at the city walls. I saw our miners tunnel beneath the fortifications, risking collapse and suffocation in their quest to breach the city's defenses. I also saw the horrors of starvation and disease. I watched as men wasted away, their bodies ravaged by dysentery and scurvy. I heard the cries of the dying, their voices echoing through the night. It was a grim reminder of the inhumanity of war, the toll it exacted on both the victors and the vanquished. Despite the hardships, there were moments of camaraderie and hope. We shared stories and jokes around the campfire, clinging to the bonds of friendship that had been forged in the crucible of battle. We celebrated small victories, such as the capture of a French supply ship or the successful repulse of a sortie. One day, as I stood guard on the ramparts overlooking the city, I noticed a figure approaching our lines. It was a French envoy, bearing a white flag of truce. He was escorted to King Edward's tent, where negotiations for the city's surrender began. The terms were harsh. The French garrison was to be spared, but 6 of the city's leading citizens were to be handed over to the English as a symbol of submission. These 6 burghers, as they were called, were to walk barefoot and bareheaded, with ropes around their necks, to the English camp. I watched as the burghers, their faces etched with despair, emerged from the city gates. They were dressed in simple tunics, bare feet, heads bowed. A hush fell over the English camp as they approached, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. King Edward, seated on a makeshift throne, regarded them with a cold, calculating gaze. He had a reputation for ruthlessness, and I could see it in his eyes now. He was not a man to be trifled with. The burghers knelt before him, their hands clasped in supplication. One of them, an elderly man with a long white beard, spoke in a trembling voice. He begged for mercy, offering to pay a ransom for the city's safety. King Edward listened impassively, his face a mask of indifference. When the old man finished speaking, he rose from his throne and addressed the burghers in a voice that cut through the silence like a knife. "You have defied my authority," he said, his words dripping with contempt. "You have resisted my rightful claim to this city. For this, you must pay the price." He turned to Sir Walter Manny, one of his most trusted knights, and gave a curt nod. Sir Walter stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. I held my breath, expecting the burghers to be executed on the spot. But then, something unexpected happened. Queen Philippa, King Edward's wife, emerged from her tent. She was a beautiful woman, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She approached her husband and whispered something in his ear. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw a flicker of doubt in the king's eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then turned back to the burghers. "By the grace of my queen," he said, his voice barely audible, "I shall spare your lives, but you shall remain my prisoners until Calais falls." A collective gasp rose from the English ranks. The burghers, their faces pale with relief, were led away under guard. Queen Philippa returned to her tent, a satisfied smile on her lips. I didn't understand the king's sudden change of heart, but I was grateful for it. The burghers had been brave men, willing to sacrifice themselves for their city. They didn't deserve to die. In the end, Calais fell to the English after a long and bitter siege. The city's capture marked a turning point in the 100 Years' War, giving England a strategic advantage over France. It was a victory that would be celebrated for generations to come. With the fall of Calais, the first phase of our invasion of France had come to a triumphant, albeit bloody, conclusion. We had achieved what many had thought impossible, defeating a powerful foe on their own soil. Yet, the war was far from over. The French, though battered and bruised, were not yet broken. They would regroup, rebuild, and return with a vengeance. I spent the next few years in France, serving King Edward in various campaigns. I fought in skirmishes and sieges, witnessed the ebb and flow of fortunes, and experienced the camaraderie and hardship that defined life as a soldier. I learned to live with the constant threat of death, to embrace the fleeting moments of joy and laughter that punctuated the grim realities of war. I made friends and lost friends, saw brave men fall in battle, and witnessed acts of both cowardice and heroism. Through it all, I never forgot my roots. I remained Will of York, the farmer's son from a small village in England. I longed for the day when I could return home, lay down my arms, and resume the simple life I had once known. One day, that dream became a reality. King Edward, having achieved his objectives in France, declared a truce and ordered his army to return to England. I was among the first to board the ships that would carry us home. As we sailed across the Channel, I stood on the deck, gazing at the white cliffs of Dover rising in the distance. A wave of emotion washed over me, a mix of relief, gratitude, and sorrow. I had survived the war, but I had also lost a part of myself in the process. I returned to York a changed man. I was no longer the naive boy who had left years ago. I was a hardened veteran, scarred by the horrors of war. Yet I was also wiser, more resilient, and more appreciative of the simple joys of life. I found my family's farm in ruins, ravaged by time and neglect. My parents were gone, having succumbed to the plague that had swept through the country while I was away. My heart ached with grief, but I knew that I couldn't dwell on the past. I set about rebuilding the farm, using the skills I had learned in the army. I planted crops, tended to the livestock, and repaired the fences and outbuildings. It was hard work, but it was also therapeutic. It gave me a sense of purpose, a way to honor my parents' memory. In time, I met a woman named Elena, a kind and gentle soul who helped me heal the wounds of war. We married and had our own children, filling the farmhouse with laughter and love. I found solace in the simple rhythms of rural life, the changing seasons, the birth of lambs, the harvest of crops. The 100 Years' War was a distant memory now, a chapter in my life that I rarely spoke of. Yet it has shaped me in profound ways. It has taught me the value of courage, loyalty, and perseverance. It showed me the darkness lurking in the human heart, but also the light of hope and compassion. I never regretted my service to King Edward. I had fought for my country, king and soldiers. I had witnessed history being made, and I had played a small but significant role in it. As I grew older, I often thought of the friends I had lost in the war, the young men whose lives had been cut short by the senseless violence. I mourned their loss, but I also celebrated their memory. They had been heroes, each one of them, and their sacrifice would never be forgotten.